As we're still getting back, maybe I can attempt a transition from the first presentation to the second. We heard about how to bend this big black arrow of a linear economy into a circle. We've seen the butterfly diagram. We maybe have talked also about stretching this circle to prolong the lifetimes by repair, cafes and so on, and how to include the consumer in this. Now we move to a related field, the field of degrowth, which basically means making this big black arrow a bit thinner, or much thinner. For that, we have invited Matthias Schmelzer, who is a postdoc researcher at the University of Jena. He has published widely on the topic. I think because we are really short of time, I will not give a very lengthy introduction. Maybe just advertise a little bit his latest book, The Future is Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism, which was just published on Verso Books, and I think is a very good read. So thank you, Matthias, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad that I can talk today about a topic that's really close to my heart, the hegemony of growth and degrowth. So you get a little preview of the slides already. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. So basically what I want to talk about today is about two aspects related to two books I've published. The one is a little bit older, and it's a historical work addressing the question why economic growth has become the key policy goal and what are the implications of this. And the second one deals with the alternatives to this growth focus. I first want to start, however, with a little reflection on the COVID crisis. The COVID-19 lockdowns present an interesting opportunity to reflect on the hegemony of growth in modern society. Closer? Okay. Oh. For the first time since the rise of the growth paradigm in the 20th century, governments deliberately shut down large parts of the economy with the aim of flattening the curve of infections and thus saving lives. While since then production has rebounded, and the accompanying greenhouse gas emissions have also started to rise again, we are also seeing a renaissance of the critique of growth, in particular in the face of the climate emergency. Focusing on the history of the growth paradigm, in this lecture, I sketched the historical making in post-war history by focusing on four entangled discourses that claim that GDP growth is good, imperative, and essentially limitless. In doing so, I will mainly draw on this first book. In the corona crisis, as Adam Tooze has demonstrated in his breathtaking account of the shutdowns of 2020, the coronavirus has caused one of the most fundamental crises of global growth-based capitalism. And this recession has been very deep. In 9 out of 10 countries globally, we have seen negative per capita growth rates, which partly, as I said, rebounded in 2021, but still demonstrate one of the most fundamental capitalist crisis in recent history. So the question, is this negative growth, a reduction in the size of the economies, only a one-time event in the case of longer history of economic crisis, such as the ones caused in 2017, or is maybe it's also something more a long-term issue. Looking at economists' debates, one might argue that this is not a one-time issue. It seems that, similar to the specter of communism in Marx's times, today another specter is haunting not just Europe, but the entire industrialized world, the specter of secular stagnation. In the wake of recent economic crisis, most fundamentally after the 2008 economic crisis, economists have stated that they believe we have entered a new stage in the history of economic development, based on the analysis that growth rates in those countries with the longest experience with economic growth, so the original OECD countries from Western Europe, North America, and Japan, that these depict a sustained decline. These economists voiced the concern that early industrialized countries might soon experience the end of economic growth. Even though not yet common sense among economists, the arguments of these, among them Lawrence Summers, Robert Solow, and Paul Krugman, have gained considerable traction due to a continuous lack in economic output, in particular in the Eurozone, and due to continuously low real interest rates close to or below zero. In the words of Barry Eichengreen, I quote, "The idea that America and the other advanced economies might be suffering from more than the hangover from a financial crisis resonated with many observers." And in this chart, you see the GDP percentage changes on the year earlier in key OECD countries between 1917 and 2020. And it clearly shows the long-term trend of falling growth rates in these early industrialized countries. This longer-term petering out of economic growth in the richest countries has become a collective nightmare of policymakers, economists, and international organizations. But why is this possible end of growth such a threatening specter and not a welcome future, as in the visions of some of the greatest economists of the 19th and 20th century, such as John Stuart Mill or John Maynard Keynes? This debate demonstrates in a nutshell the high priority attached to economic growth among economic experts, governments, and the general public. It shows, and here I quote Kenneth Rogoff, professor at Harvard and former chief economist at the IMF, how strongly the obsession with maximizing long-term average income growth has become the be-all and end-all of policy. And not only across the entire, almost the entire political spectrum, but also basically in all countries. So the question is how this all-encompassing priority of economic growth emerged historically. But before delving into this, I want to highlight some of the key characteristics, again, of the COVID lockdowns that might be interesting for the question of future fit economies, economic models and policies that move beyond growth. Because the lockdowns in parts of the world demonstrate, despite all the differences one might discuss here, that for the first time in world history, countries deliberately shut down, or countries deliberately and in a planned manner, shut down large segments of their economies with the aim of this higher good, flattening the curve and thus saving lives. They did so with large majorities democratically supporting these policies, at least in many European countries. For the first lockdown in 2020, that was the main cause of the economic contraction. These policies differentiated by sectors, not shutting down, but rather protecting those sectors that were deemed life-supporting and systemically relevant because of the use, values, and services they produce, mainly health services, public services, and food. And these lockdowns led to a considerable reduction of the ecological destruction of modern economies, in particular as measured by CO2. I come back to this later, but I think it's a very interesting case study to think about what actually a reduction of economies could look like. So coming back to the question of the priority of economic growth. In light of the sweeping accepting of the pursuit of economic growth as a policy goal, it is easy to forget that not only the reality of economic expansion, but even more so growth as a key category of economic and public discourse is a surprisingly recent phenomenon. Before the 1820s, when economic growth accelerated in the context of industrial revolution, economic activity around the world had been characterized by periodic ups and downs, only expanding by an average of 0.05% annually, as far as this can be measured retrospectively, which is really difficult. And this very slow increase was largely due to the very slow increase of the populations. So economic growth is as a phenomenon is a very recent. Even more recently, the term economic growth was not widely used before the middle of the 20th century. But during the 1950s, it advanced to become a key notion, not only within economics, but in other social sciences. This chart depicts the changing percentage of the occurrence of the term economic growth in all the books included in the largest book database between 1900 and 2000 in English, French, and German. It shows the rapid rise of the term from basically non-existence before the mid-1940s to global preeminence since the 1970s. And a similar evolution can be seen by focusing on the percentage of academic articles in the JSTOR database that include this term, shown here between 1940 and 2000 for various disciplines. So how can this change be explained, and what does it indicate? Scholars from a variety of fields have highlighted the importance of growth and have described this growth as a fetish or obsession, an ideology, an axiomatic necessity, or a social imaginary. The latter description, by the way, from the anarchist philosopher and social critic Cornelius Castoriadis, who worked under a pseudonym at the OECD economics department in the 50s and 60s. However, while studies on economic growth, explaining, assessing, and modeling its causes, effects, and various growth policies, however, while these constitute the core of both economics and economic history, there are strikingly few accounts on the history of this concept, on how the pursuit of growth became the essential goal of economic policymaking and a key priority taken for granted among social scientists, politicians, and the general public. This is all the more striking since one could argue, following US historian John McNear, that the priority attached to growth is or might be the most important idea of the 20th century. So I started to dig into this question and do some historical research, basically asking the simple question and going into the archives, mainly of the OECD, to answer it. How did economic growth come to be almost universally seen as self-evident goal of economic policymaking? And how was the self-evidence constantly reproduced in changing circumstances? So how has growth been defined? How was it justified? What policies were pursued in its name? And how was it questioned? So I can't really go into the details of the basically historical archive-based analysis in the context of the OECD, an international organization basically responsible for defining what good policies in a capitalist economy should look like. But I just want to pitch some of the main results that came out of this. To answer these research questions, I described the emergence, functioning, and evolution of what I call the growth paradigm. I used the term to describe a specific ensemble of societal, political, and academic discourses, theories, and practices, also mainly statistical standards, that jointly assert and justify the view that GDP growth is desirable, imperative, and essentially limitless. These four discourses are highlighted in this study, and they assumed that GDP, with all its inscribed reductions, assumptions, and exclusions, basically adequately measures economic activity. And obviously, there's a lot of things you know about these. Most of these one can discuss here. All the critiques of GDP as a flawed measure of well-being, of standard of living, etc., etc. These discourses also claimed that growth was basically a universal solution for a multitude of often changing socioeconomic challenges. So for some of the main challenges of Western societies, in particular historical circumstances, growth was seen as the main solution. They also claimed that growth was essentially unlimited, provided the correct governmental and intergovernmental policies were pursued. And this obviously is still going on as a policy discourse, changing how it's justified, but still justifying the possibility of endless growth today. And finally, that GDP growth was practically the same as what a necessary means to achieve essential goals. So some of the main goals societies hold anyways, such as increasing prosperity and welfare, progress and modernity, or national power and prestige, all these, the growth paradigm claimed, were basically achieved through increasing economic growth, or increasing economic growth is a necessary condition to achieve these essential goals. In the book, I try to disentangle the complex interplay of these mutually reinforcing strands and to explore the politics behind this growth paradigm. One key argument analyzes the measure GDP. Here I argue that the global proliferation of GDP statistics as the key measure for economic activity was not based on a scientific consensus. On the contrary, it were in particular the political demands for comparative data of international organizations and governments that proved decisive. In fact, in the middle of the 20th century, most economists argued against the use of national income statistics as a measurement of the wealth of nations and for international comparisons over time and over space. Actually, most of the controversies that are currently waged about how GDP mismeasures our lives, to quote a recent study by Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi, most of these controversies can be traced back to the period of the making and international standardization of national income accounting in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And key terms of these debates were externalities, non-monetary housework, and subsistence. So basically, the people who invented these numbers warned against the political use of these numbers. However, governments and international organizations which acutely required comparative statistics to manage member country contributions, so which country pays how much, for example, to the United Nations or the OECD, and to measure international aid flows, so which country should contribute how much in the Cold War setting to the international aid efforts to the Global South. These international organizations and governments cut short the academic disputes, a process that reveals the specific reductions, assumptions, and exclusions inscribed in national income accounting. This international standardization, in which the OEC, so the European organization responsible for distributing the Marshall Plan aid, with a lot of pressure from the United States, they created a uniform conception of the economy and an internationally homogenized lingua franca that increasingly became used by governments, international organizations, and also, interestingly, the globalizing discipline of economics. So the growth paradigm basically moved out of the policy sphere, where it was became hegemonic because governments found these numbers very, very useful, and then moved into the sphere of economics as a discipline. The international standardization and the deeply entrenched associations in public discourses now have gridlocked the present standard of measuring prosperity, welfare, making it extremely difficult to establish fundamental alternatives. And the fact that I study, I can't go into this now, but maybe later in the discussion, I study by analyzing the vain efforts launched since the 1970s, when the public basically realized that these numbers are highly problematic, the vain efforts to basically establish alternatives. And these are still going on until the present day. So while the specific challenges that according to growth discourses could only be met by GDP growth continuously changed, the reliance on growth as some kind of panacea or universal solution, this has remained stable. Going through the various decades in the post-war period, you find that growth was always framed, also within the OECD, but also internationally, as the key solution to the most pressing societal problems of the time. As just argued, GDP numbers served key interests of international organizations and states in the early 1950s. Subsequently, the political focus on growth as the goal first emerged as a war and post-war response to the economic and social problems associated with rearmament, European reconstruction, political instability, colonial decline, and the Cold War. Most importantly, growth promised to turn difficult political conflicts over the distribution of basically the national wealth into technical, seemingly non-political management questions of how to collectively increase GDP. By thus transforming class and other social antagonisms into apparent win-win situations, the growth paradigm proved instrumental in creating the consensual politics and the stability of the post-war decades. Based on the newly produced GDP numbers and driven by international competition and Cold War rivalry, growthmanship became a seemingly inevitable vocation among Western policymakers. Expand or die was the key slogan that shaped the debates within international Western policy circles in the post-war decades. International organizations, and in particular the comparative data on growth rates they started to publicize in the 1950s, played a key role in the construction of this competitive normative epistemology of growth rates that underpinned what contemporaries at that time aptly described as competitive targetry, so the setting of bold numerical growth targets in the early 1960s by numerous national governments. So to conclude the first part of this lecture, economic growth has in fact raised the standard of living of millions of people, even though socially and geographically very unevenly. And it still is the rallying cry for millions of others who hope for a better life. However, there are good reasons to question the continued policy focus on quantitative growth in industrialized countries. These center not only on the likely difficulty or even impossibility of achieving long-term growth rates in original OECD countries, independently of all the critiques, the whole debate about secular stagnation that I referred to in the beginning. But they also question whether further GDP growth is actually beneficial to human well-being, equality, distribution, happiness, and unemployment, and whether environmental crisis, key among them climate change, can actually be alleviated without curbing economic growth. And I'll come to this in the second part. Given these problems, the pervasiveness of GDP as a measure of social well-being and of growth as a policy goal seem rather peculiar, a puzzle or paradox in need of explanation. I argue that the ideal of growth and its underlying expertise are neither neutral, analytical categories, nor can they be taken for granted as having always already been there, despite this being the main perspective in economics and economic history. Rather, the notion that the pursuit of GDP growth should be a key societal goal and the techniques of measuring, modeling, and prescribing growth have emerged, historically speaking, quite recently and have identifiable and very contested histories of their own. And rather than springing fully formed into prominence, they were produced and promoted by very specific people and institutions in very particular contexts with particular interests, all of which shape the outlook of growth policies until this day. So knowing this history of growthism is key to understand what's going on in ecological policy debates today. And in fact, for understanding, I would argue, the challenges of transforming the transformation to future fit economies. So after having studied the history and hegemony of this growth paradigm, I personally moved on to focus more on the alternatives, and I want to present this also today. And it mainly resulted in a book, The Future is Degrowth, that was actually published yesterday. So I'm still a bit involved in all the publicity around it that's going on. And yeah, thanks. And I want to give a bit of information about the book in the remainder. So here you see the table of contents. I can't go through all of the chapters, but basically it starts with focusing on what is economic growth, then analyzes the critiques of economic growth, and then moves on to degrowth alternatives, studying these in details. What are the different visions? What are definitions? What are the pathways? And how can the transformation, so the strategies, etc., how can these be conceptualized? So what is degrowth? Degrowth is a term that is increasingly mobilized by scholars and activists to criticize what I discussed so far, so to criticize the hegemony of growth. And it's a proposal for a radical reorganization of society that leads to a drastic reduction in the use of energy and resources, while at the same time having a high standard of living for all. And it's a slogan that is deemed, or a transformation that is deemed necessary, desirable, and possible. Degrowth starts from the fact, demonstrated by an increasing number of studies, that further economic growth in industrialized countries is unsustainable. Even if this growth is termed green or inclusive, or even if it's part of a transformative progressive agenda, such as the Green New Deal, that massively invests in renewable energies and the sustainability transition, even then, economic growth is problematic. Industrialized countries cannot reduce the environmental impact, so emissions and material throughput fast and sufficiently enough, while at the same time growing their economies. The hope in green growth in mainstream climate debates has produced climate policies that have, in the last 3 decades, led to nothing close to the reduction in emissions necessary. And here I show the climate inaction stripes that have gone viral recently. I don't know if you've seen them. So they're basically combining the trends in atmospheric CO2 temperature change, and you see the continuous rise that is unabated, with some key political events that have been happening around the negotiations around climate policies, which have so far not led to any reductions of these emissions. And one of the key reasons for this, and I come to this, is the focus on economic growth. So what is the challenge that we need to face? This graph shows the necessary emission reduction path if we are to avoid relying on negative emission technologies, which are highly problematic. It's a whole topic that we could talk about. And it's really steep. Even more, and this is just the global numbers. The necessary emission reduction necessary for industrialized countries are even steeper if we take into account historical emissions and the climate debt associated with it. So we're talking about emission reductions in the order of magnitude around 10% for European countries or other rich, comparatively rich countries. And these are among the magnitudes, just to put this into perspective, that we experienced during the first lockdown of the COVID, during the first period of the COVID lockdowns, but not just as a one-time event, but as a continuous process until full decarbonization. This gives basically a picture of the challenge we are facing. It's not a long-time challenge, but it's a very short-term challenge. And basically, Degrowth is arguing that this is impossible, or it's much, much more difficult, but very, very likely impossible if during this next decade or the next decades, we at the same time increase the size of the rich countries' economies. So to answer the question of this challenge, long-standing debates on the possibility or impossibility of decoupling GDP from resource use and emissions have emerged, that you've all heard of. The mainstream answer to this challenge is basically, yes, we need to reduce emissions. Yes, we need to phase out fossil fuels, but we can do this while at the same time increasing the size of the economy through green growth. We just shift basically the energy and resource basis of our economies. And this is not in contrast with the continued growth, focus on growth. However, there's an increasing number of studies that quite convincingly show that this is very unlikely to happen. And I'm just going to quote 2 studies here. The first by Jason Hickel and Georgos Kallis from a study called Is Green Growth Possible? Basically comes to the conclusion after reviewing the literature that there is no empirical evidence that absolute decoupling from resource use can be achieved on a global scale against a background of continued economic growth, and that absolute decoupling from carbon emissions is highly unlikely to be achieved at a rate rapid enough to prevent global warming over 1.5 or even the less ambitious goal of 2%. And in this graph from the study, you see that there is indeed some relative decoupling of global CO2 emissions. The CO2 emissions grow slower globally than the economies. And we see this even more pronounced as also a modest form of absolute decoupling within some European economies, but not in all. I just looked up the numbers for Slovenia, which are quite interesting because if you look at the production-based CO2 emissions, they have gone down quite dramatically. But if you look at the consumption-based emissions, so those including the imports of goods and services into the economy, then there's since the 1990s been a quite steep increase of the emissions. The second quote I want to give is from a large review that has been reviewing hundreds of studies on this question and comes to the conclusion that large, rapid, absolute reductions of resource use and greenhouse gas emissions cannot be achieved through observed decoupling rates. Hence, decoupling needs to be complemented by sufficiency-oriented strategies and strict enforcement of absolute reduction targets. So this already gives a bit of the impression what's the challenge and why we need to talk about degrowth. Degrowth is not against decoupling. Degrowth is not against using more efficient technologies and the transition to post-fossil resources and energies. But it's saying that in addition to this, we should also focus on demand reductions and sufficiency. At this point, many people worry, is degrowth about ecological austerity, about tightening the belts of the poor to advance an ecological dictatorship? Or they wonder, is this not against a world that improves living standards for all? To answer this, some points are essential. To begin with, it is key to understand how unequal global carbon emissions are distributed. And we all know the global numbers. The richest 1% of the world's population are responsible for more than twice as much carbon pollution as 3.1 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity during a critical 25-year period of unprecedented economic growth. So according to Oxfam, 1% have twice as much emissions as the lower half of humanity. However, these carbon emissions are also highly unequally distributed within rich countries. Here are numbers for the European Union. And you see that, again, here, the top 1% are have a much higher carbon footprint than the lower parts. So degrowth basically makes the claim, let's focus on the rich. Let's focus on those with the highest emissions, because without reducing these emissions and without transforming the lifestyle associated with these emissions that basically everyone globally strives to achieve in the context of the imperial mode of living, without these changes, real sustainability is impossible. So it's basically saying that the lifestyle of the richest 10% globally cannot be made sustainable, and we need to focus on those aspects of these lifestyles that are particularly problematic. And as you see here in this graph on the left side, these are mainly related to some high forms of mobility, such as air travel, but also to land travel, manufacturing goods, etc., etc. What's also interesting that while the emissions over the last, since 1990, the emissions of almost all population decreased, the emissions of the richest 1% were actually increasing. So again, here we see that the trend is going in the opposite direction of where it actually should be going. So the second thing to keep in mind is that economic growth is not benefiting everyone, but again, mainly the rich. So the myth of trickle down is very problematic and is often standing in the way of people seeing that alternatives are actually on our table. Most people think we need more economic growth to fight poverty. But in effect, who is benefiting from economic growth? The World Inequality report that just came out last year shows that of the economic growth, so the additional wealth generated globally between 1995 and 2021, the bottom 50% only captured 2% of this additional wealth. So they didn't really benefit of this economic growth, but they are the ones who have to bear the most of the costs of this economic growth, ecologically, socially, etc. While the top 1% globally captured 38% of this global wealth. And the axis is squeezed. You see this with the numbers here. if it wouldn't be lengthened, the curve would be going up much higher and steeper. So from this, you see again that degrowth is very much a global justice agenda, because thirdly, it's very important to highlight that degrowth is not about a global transformation of politics, but it's rather focusing on what needs to change in those countries in the global north that have industrialized earliest and have the highest ecological footprint and the most problematic forms of economic growth. These early industrialized countries need to reduce their emissions and environmental. They cannot reduce their environmental emissions and impacts fast enough to leave development space for the global south, degrowth argues, and for these reasons need to reduce the size of their economies. So it's a globally differentiated global justice agenda that we're talking about. And fourthly, I want to highlight that degrowth is the opposite of ecological austerity. It's in fact about creating the conditions for public abundance, a post-scarcity vision of society beyond capitalism. While this need for sufficiency, so a need for a reduction of the material throughput for the most affluent and an end to overconsumption may sound radical to many, it is increasingly common ground among ecologically oriented progressives. Degrowth claims that such a transformation in the global north is not only possible, but also desirable. It is feasible to live well without economic growth and to make society more just, democratic, and truly prosperous on the way. To do this, however, a fundamental political and economic reorganization of society is necessary, which aims at overcoming multiple structural growth dependencies inherent in the capitalist economy, from industrialized infrastructure to social systems to ideological myths around the growth paradigm. The main challenge, however, is that capitalism is structurally dependent on growth, and it is stabilized through the imperial mode of living in the centers that focuses or is built around growth. So to do the transformation, we need to start with understanding that capitalism is a system that needs growth. And what this means is it needs ever-increasing quantities of production. Under capitalism, the purpose of production is not in order to meet human needs, but rather to extract and accumulate surplus value. In capitalism, which is a competitive system, companies need to compete to basically depress their inputs, to depress the cost of labor and nature as the inputs into the capitalist process. So all the labor laws and standards, environmental regulation, etc. Without intervention, capitalism constantly produces crisis and inequality and eventually ecological breakdown. And this doesn't happen, or this happens because capital basically by definition must take more from labor and nature than it gives back in return. It is inherently exploitative. And this is also the main reason for the failure of the environmental policies shown in the climate inaction stripes in the beginning. What we need to do is to shift to a post-growth economy, one that's capable of meeting human needs at a high standard of, with a much lower level of aggregate production. And the good news is, and I come to this now, that research increasingly shows that such a system is actually possible. So in the book, we first have a chapter that is explaining what is economic growth. And I can't go into the details here, just want to mention that we define economic growth as three processes. The one is growth as an idea. Growth as basically the growth paradigm that I talked about in the beginning, as GDP as an ideology that is very powerfully shaping capitalist societies. Secondly, economic growth is a social process related to the capitalist relations of production and consumption, and it is a process of dynamic stabilization that is stabilizing capitalist societies through the imperialist mode of living, leading to acceleration, escalation, and increase. And thirdly, economic growth is also a material process, the ever-expanding use of land, materials, and energy. And we need to look at all three dimensions because they are related and cannot fundamentally be dissociated from each other. And just to give a very rough impression of the material dimension of economic growth, I brought this amazing study that came out last year by Elasham and colleagues that basically sketches the weight of anthropogenic mass. So all the stuff produced by human societies, and compares this to global biomass. And you see here this this growth curve that is accelerating very rapidly since, in particular, the phase of the Great Acceleration, so the 1950s and 60s, and is still continuing to increase and is also projected to increase. So this is the material dimension, independently of all the energy problems, the material dimension of global capitalism that we need to transform. And the question is, can this be transformed through a circular economy at this scale, or do we not need to downscale this material size of the economy? And since decoupling is only possible to some extent, do we not radically need to break the growth trajectory in general? So far, I've mainly highlighted some of the ecological critiques of economic growth. But it's important to understand that degrowth is much broader and includes many other critiques of economic growth that I can't go into today, but I just wanted to mention that they are around there and are all very important and each contribute an essential part to what I would argue is a comprehensive analysis of the growth problem. In the book, we distinguish 7 different forms of critique of growth, each of which coming from a whole entire tradition of literature with specific arguments, etc., etc. The main argument from the ecological critique, as I've highlighted, basically says economic growth destroys the ecological foundations of human life, and it cannot be made or cannot be transformed to become sustainable, at least for the highly industrialized countries. The second one basically says that economic growth mismeasures our lives and thus stands in the way of well-being and equality for all. And there's a huge literature around welfare economics, social history, etc., that is showing that while economic growth has continued to increase in rich countries since in the whole period since the 1970s, since around then, standards of living, happiness, the well-being of people has not really increased. And it's a really fascinating problem discussed as the Easterlin paradox within economics that I think opens up the possibility for a good life beyond growth, or for the argument that economic growth is not improving the lives of people anymore. So we need to actually shift focus. If we want to improve the lives of people, it doesn't happen as a byproduct, as an automatic byproduct of economic growth, but we need to focus on human needs directly. The cultural critique argues that economic growth produces alienating ways of working, living, and relating to each other and nature. And here's all the arguments around consumerism and etc., etc. The critique of capitalism argues that economic growth depends on and is driven by capitalist exploitation and accumulation. And it's a very foundational critique for degrowth because it's basically making clear that the transition to a degrowth economy, to an economy beyond economic growth, also needs to be a transition out of these capitalist dependencies on growth, because otherwise we'll run into a crisis mode. And one of the key slogans from the degrowth movement is, your recession is not our degrowth, to basically distinguish what we are talking about when we talk about a reduction in the size of the economy, very clearly from what is happening in capitalist crisis, in situations like during the lockdowns, but more importantly during unplanned reductions of economic activities after the 2008 crisis, for example. The critique of industrialism states that economic growth gives rise to undemocratic productive forces and techniques. and that in order to shift to a more human forms of unalienated democratic forms of technology, we also need to address these directly. So it's not just enough to basically take the productive forces that have developed in modern societies and use them in a different way, but these productive forces, the technologies we are using, they themselves have forms that are problematic. And the feminist critique, which is also very essential, argues that economic growth is based on gendered overexploitation and necessarily devalues reproduction. It's very foundational for the entire critique of GDP accounting, and has many of the arguments that are now more or less becoming mainstream within economics, because people start to understand that GDP is problematic. They come out of feminist analysis since the 1970s. And finally, the South-North critique argues that economic growth relies on and reproduces relations of domination, extraction, exploitation between capitalist centers and peripheries. So from this, you basically get an overview of the broad outlook the degrowth perspective tries to make in terms of its critiques. So what is degrowth actually about? In the book, we developed this as a definition, and I hope this might help for the discussion, and then we can go deeper into all the aspects of it. Degrowth, we argue, is the democratic transition to a society that first, in order to enable global ecological justice, has a much smaller throughput of energy and resources, and is thus also a smaller economy. Secondly, in this transformation towards a smaller throughput, it ensures justice, self-determination, and a good life for all under this changed and much smaller metabolism. And thirdly, it does an economy that does not depend on growth and continuous expansion for the stability of its institutions and for the continued functioning. And each of this aspect is certainly very key and is very complex. And I want to highlight this here, that I would argue that degrowth is much more a provocation starting a debate than a finished concept, because the challenges are so foundational. And they are so foundational because we live in societies in which almost all of our institutions developed in the context of economic growth and are fundamentally linked to economic growth. So for example, there's a whole literature about the relationships between the emergence of mass democracies through the power of workers' unions and the use of fossil fuels in the context of growth economies. So to some degree, mass democracy emerged historically and is enabled through economic growth. So it's not an easy question to answer how we can actually continue these advantages or the things that social movements have struggled for and achieved during this phase of economic growth, how they can be prolonged and defended and deepened in the context of post-growth. But this is essentially the challenge that we need to address in the context of degrowth. So to do this, in the degrowth literature emerged a rather wide array of different proposals for how this transformation could actually be conceptualized. And it's very complex. In the book, we have a different typology than the one here, but I just put on the slides some of the key policy proposals that are out there. And I just want to highlight some of them. The first one is the selective growth and degrowth. Many people who hear about degrowth have the intuitive counter-argument that it doesn't make sense to talk about degrowth because certainly there are things that need to grow. And degrowth agrees wholeheartedly. Yes, we need to expand certain sectors of the economy. We need to expand the use of renewables, and we need to invest in this. This investment, however, should be democratized in a very fundamental way. And yes, we need to expand social services. We need to expand the universal provisioning of basic goods, etc. So there's a lot of sectors and activities in society that need to expand. But at the same time, we should not just focus on these expanding sectors as the mainstream climate debate does, and as also most of the Green New Deal proposals do, and simply hope that these will outcompete and outgrow the basically dirty and problematic parts of the economy. But we should focus on the degrowth, the shrinking, the abandonment of these problematic sectors. And we should have policies that directly address this issue of phasing out those sectors of the economy that cannot be made sustainable. That's the one issue, and that do not produce a lot of use values. And this is another key issue. We live in societies, as we've discussed regarding the issue of planned obsolescence and similar stuff. There's a whole discussion about bullshit jobs. Many people do work that doesn't, of which they know themselves that it doesn't create use values. So we live in societies that, because they focus on the production of profits, on accumulation, doesn't really produce the use values we need, but many other things that are highly polluting. And I think this is a huge opportunity to basically shift the priorities and also degrow basically these sectors and activities. So after having tried to say something about this very common misunderstanding, some of the key policies in the degrowth space are conceptualized as non-reformist reforms, term by André Gortz, one of the persons who introduced also the term degrowth in the 1970s. And they are also often conceptualized as revolutionary realpolitik, a term by Rosa Luxemburg. So basically, these are policies that do not need to wait until some revolution or big transformation in the future, but they start in the here and now, addressing the structures that we are living in, try to improve the situation for further improvements in the future, and basically open up spaces for transformative change. And we hope that some of these proposals at least could become hegemonic as a counter hegemony to the growth focus. And many of these are increasingly common sense among the, let's say, climate justice left. But some of these are also very particular, and I want to highlight mostly the two of these. The first is a focus on the reduction of high incomes. So in addition to basically arguing we should have a lower floor for a basic income that enables a good life for everyone to participate in society, we should also focusing on an upper floor of an acceptable level of income and wealth in society. And this could be thought of as 5 times the basic income in a society, or 20 times. It could also be done within certain companies. So the highest paid job in this company cannot be more than something times than the lowest paid job. And I think we should have discussions about this, because without this, we cannot address the very unequal consumption that I showed in the slides earlier. And the other part I want to focus on, or I want to highlight here, is basically that degrowth very much focuses on the provision of public services. So rather than focusing on how we can safeguard private incomes in the context of this transition, we should actually shift to focus on public services and creating public luxuries instead of the private luxuries that only the few can afford. And I think this is very key when we look at the debates that always emerge when ecological modernist politics try to address the climate issues, such as, for example, the increasing or using taxes to increase the price of fossil fuels. Then we necessarily see a class-based reaction to this, because people cannot afford anymore what they need to sustain their lives. And instead of policies such as these, or in addition to these, we necessarily need a focus on basically publicly providing the services that people need in order to address this challenge of basically reducing the overall consumption. But as you can see, there are many other proposals that we could go on in the discussion that are focusing on this overall picture of the degrowth transition that is necessary. But I want to start to come to the end by highlighting, firstly, that degrowth is not, or that we argue that it's not about the label degrowth. And thinking about the transformation, we think it's very unlikely that a large movement will emerge that says we are for degrowth, and that under this movement or in following this movement, this transformation is actually happening. Rather, we argue that in other debates, the critiques and perspectives of degrowth need to be taken up if they are not yet represented. In many contexts, they are not yet represented. So if you look at debates that we had yesterday about just transitions, for example, these debates often do not take into account sufficiently the challenges that degrowth tries to address. And we would say, rather than abandoning just transition as a discourse and practice, just transition debates, trade union discourses should incorporate these critiques and perspectives of degrowth. And similar with transition towns, the issue, the entire debate about circular economy, the whole climate justice debate, feminist movements, etc. And to advance this, we did a project based in Germany first, and then this was also later translated in this book, Degrowth in Movements, Exploring Pathways for Transformation, where we basically collaborated with around 30 different social movements in this, what we called the mosaic of alternatives for a future beyond growth, industrialism, and capitalism. So a very broad category of movements that are open to degrowth, but don't work with the term. And we invited authors to a workshop, to a small conference, and then had a long networking process to write chapters on what they think about degrowth, what they can learn from degrowth, but also what degrowth should learn from these perspectives. And I think in this spirit, we want to advance basically this degrowth as a networking perspective that tries to build a much broader movement, not under the label of degrowth, but incorporating the critiques and proposals of degrowth. And I want to highlight this because the question of transformation that I want to come to now is so difficult. And very often people struggle with answering how should actually this degrowth transformation be, how should this be conceptualized? How can we think about this? And I think it's actually impossible to answer the question of the degrowth transformation if we only see it in this narrow degrowth framing, but we need to see it much broader. In the book, we distinguish 3 different strategies for transformation. So the first one, and this all draws on the work of sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who some of you might know, very, very influential and I highly recommend reading all of his works. So we distinguish these 3 different strategies. Firstly, interstitial strategies that create more basically cooperative economic practices and spaces that do not follow the logics of capitalism, growth, and competition within existing structures. And if we look at the networks and groups and people involved in the degrowth debate, a lot of these, at least in some European contexts, have actually started to use degrowth as an overall framework within which to see their practices. So if you look at transition towns, repair cafes, etc., this is already very closely related to degrowth. The second one is the non-reformist reforms that I already talked about. So this is the second transformation strategy, and basically the idea is to transform economic incentives in society so that these nautopias, the cooperative economic structures that are emerging from the bottom, that they do have a chance to actually expand, to actually prosper and flourish in our economies. And this is how we can see basically the interlinkage between the two, creating within the nautopias, creating imaginaries and hopes and a desire for transformation, which is then strengthened by the non-reformist reforms. And I think Barbara Muraka will be talking about this in the next talk, because she has very much focused on the production of these desires in these nautopias. And thirdly, we distinguish ruptural strategies, so strategies for building counter-hegemony and parallel institutions of power that basically through confrontational strategies such as strikes, blockades, citizens' assemblies, or autonomously organized municipalities, alternative forms of government, etc., that make it basically possible to break with the logic of growth in individual sectors or regions of society and then enlarge from this. We argue that the transformation towards a degrowth society requires an interplay of all these three types of strategies. We stress, however, that building counter-hegemony and parallel structures of power is paramount, despite so far being underexplored within the degrowth debate. So this is the one where most of the work still needs to be happening. It's because we argue it's only through collective power and the development of new kinds of common senses that it becomes possible to basically productively relate the other transformation approaches, now-utopias and non-reformist reforms, and envision degrowth becoming actually a reality. So I want to finish this talk with basically highlighting that degrowth has opened up a very broad field of research that is developing in many different disciplines. And I think there's many things to explore. And I see it much more as a research agenda than a finished policy agenda. And I want to invite you all to use the time you have to contribute to this effort, because I think it's crucially essential for our futures. Thank you very much.